Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our service sermon. I hope you've been watching the other videos, and it's trying to make it feel a bit more like church at the moment. So, my sermon is taken from about John 14, starting at verse 1, ending at verse 14. But here's a question for you. I wonder what is troubling your heart today. For me, the list is long and it's not pretty. It's a bit like a crushing, excruciating heart attack. I think about all the words and the prayers that I've offered to God over the last couple of years to plead and ask about why there's violence and why there's suffering in the world. I think about the protests that seem to be everywhere. I think about healthcare, immigration, refugees. I think about violence, racism, and poverty. I think about the stories of bullying and the stories of suicides. I think about ISIS, Russia, North Korea, and increasing tensions around the globe and even in our own country. I think about our own political dysfunction at times, covering all parties. And I think about those grieving and mourning the death of a loved one. I think about families that are struggling, spouses that are divorcing, children that are hungry, and people that are literally hanging on just by the smallest of threads. I think about my own sorrows, my own losses, and my own disappointments. And I think about the way today's gospel gets interpreted and used to exclude, condemn, and bludgeon others. And probably above all that, at this moment, like you, I guess, I think about this dreadful virus. Despite what Jesus says about not letting your hearts be troubled, my heart is troubled, and I suspect yours might be as well. What would you add to my list? What's troubling your heart today? None of us get through this life without a troubled heart. I don't think we can look at the pain of the world today, the suffering of a loved one, or our own wounds and hurts, and not have a troubled heart. At least I hope we can't. And that's the context in which I hear Jesus say, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." It's not that different from the context in which Jesus said those words. It's the night of the Last Supper. Jesus has announced his departure from this world, his death. Feet have been washed. Judas has left the table and stepped into the nightmare of betrayal. Peter will break the silence with a threefold denial. Thomas is lost and asks, "How can we know the way?" Philip has lost his centre and can't see what is right in front of him. He says, "Lord, show us the Father and we will be satisfied." Jesus says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." Do not let your hearts be troubled. Are you kidding me? Is Jesus really serious about that? Does he know what's happening in our lives and in our world? How can Jesus say that with a straight face when he was troubled at seeing Mary and the Jews weeping at the death of Lazarus? When he said that his own soul was troubled? And when John tells us that Jesus was troubled in spirit, what is Jesus telling us? It's not as if there is an on-off switch for troubled hearts. How do we begin to make sense of today's gospel in a world whose heart is constantly troubled and is in incredible fear at the moment? It's not hard to understand why this text is so often used at funerals. Death troubles our hearts and we want to find some balance, some stability, some harmony. This text, however, is more than just about the afterlife. It has something to say right here and right now. It speaks to the very circumstances that trouble our hearts today. I would say it speaks to the situation that we face with this ongoing trouble with this virus. Think about the times when your heart's been troubled. Maybe it's now. Maybe it was years ago. What does it feel like? We all experience it in our own ways, but see if this sounds familiar. Isolated, paralysed, overwhelmed, powerless, off balance, out of control, disconnected, afraid, thoughts spinning around your head, no stability, despair, grief, tears, anger. I wonder if you recognise any of those. In the midst of a troubled heart, the unspoken question is this: will the centre hold, or is everything collapsing around us? Thomas and Philip are feeling the collapse. Much of the world is, and maybe we are too. But will the centre hold? That essentially is our question. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Jesus recognises that our hearts are troubled. He's not warning us about the future condition. He knows the troubling has already begun. He can see it in us because he's experienced it within himself. He also knows that our lives and the world are not defined or limited to what troubles. What if not letting our hearts be troubled begins with looking into our hearts and seeing and naming those troubles? That may be the first and most difficult thing Jesus asks in our gospel today. I don't know about you, but sometimes I just don't want to see. I don't want to name it. It's too difficult and too painful. It takes me too close to the edge of the abyss and free falling and collapsing my life. Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know? Thomas speaks for all of us. We've lost our centre, and so how do you re-centre? Where do we go when it seems that everything is collapsing around us? And here's the paradox. Sometimes we have to lose our centre in order to find it. I want to be clear about this. I'm not suggesting that God purposely decenters us. Decentering happens. It's just a part of life, sadly. It's a part of the human condition. Sometimes it comes out of circumstance we didn't create or choose. Other times it's a consequence of our choices and our actions. Regardless though, Jesus says that this is not a place to stay or a way to live. It's not the life he lives or the life that he offers us. If your heart is troubled, then it's time to recenter. Recentering doesn't mean our hearts won't be troubled. It doesn't necessarily fix the problem, whatever the problem might be. But it does mean that our lives are tethered to something greater than ourselves. It means that our hearts are held secure by the divine life. And we're not free-falling into absolute despair. Jesus is reminding us that there is a centre, and actually that centre is not us. It's not the UK, it's not her laws or what governs us. It's not even the church and her creeds and doctrines. It's not our success, accomplishments, positions or power. We do not have to be the centre, nor do we need to establish it. In fact, we can't. Instead, we wake up to it. We already know the way to and the place of this centre. Jesus says. Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied, Philip says to Jesus. He's bought into that lie that the Father is apart from, outside of, and distant from himself. The centre, however, is within. The Father's house is within. The kingdom is within. Wherever you go, there is the centre. Wherever you face, there is the centre. Whoever you are, there is the centre. Regardless of what troubles, there is the centre. Not because you are the centre, but because God is within. In the language of today's gospel, the centre is the Father's house, and there are many dwelling places in this house. In the Father's house there is a dwelling place for every single troubled heart. I'm not talking about the afterlife, and I'm not thinking of this as some sort of celestial sort of hotel for those who have enough right, enough belief, and have done the right behaviour to get in. I'm talking about the dwelling place as the way God's life intersects with our own. With our own, he shows us mercy, forgiveness, justice, generosity, compassion, healing, love and beauty, wisdom, hope, courage, joy, and also intimacy. These are the dwelling places for a troubled heart, places of recentering. So every time we live into and express the divine attributes of our way of being with our words or by our actions, we regain our centre, restore our balance, and take up residence in the Father's house. What in you today needs recentering? Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many dwelling places. How might centeredness, balance and harmony within yourself help you see and respond to your troubles or the troubles of the world differently? Jesus says, in my Father's house there are many dwelling places. What if in the midst of troubles in your heart you could maintain a normal rhythm and beat with God's life? Jesus says, in my Father's house there are many dwelling places. Many people today are racked with fear, are still afraid. It might not mean that you stop getting afraid, and it may not mean that the virus and what other things are making you scared at the moment goes away just like that. But if you truly recenter yourself and allow yourself to acknowledge and to welcome God and Jesus into your own heart, that recentering will help you carry on. My hope and my prayer for all of us today and for the rest of this week is that we can all use that we can all rest in that we can take time, maybe now after this, to just have a few moments of quiet where we ask God back into our hearts. We ask him to recenter us, to give us the strength and to give us a peace that we all need to be in that rhythm that he's created. God bless.